Have you ever felt like the kindest person in the room somehow became the most controlled, the most drained, the most invisible? Like your empathy, the very thing that makes you human, was slowly turned against you. But what if I told you there comes a moment when the empath stops absorbing the pain and starts reflecting it back with quiet power? This isn't a story about revenge, and it's definitely not about shouting louder. It's about the moment something inside shifts, when the empath finally sees the game, understands the patterns, and no longer plays along. Carl Jung believed that when we confront the shadow, we awaken a force that cannot be manipulated, and tonight, you're about to discover what happens when that awakening begins. Why does the narcissist start to lose control? Why does silence become more powerful than words? And why does this transformation feel terrifying yet deeply freeing? If any part of this feels familiar, stay with me, because the final insight might change the way you see your relationships forever. And before we go deeper, gently tap the subscribe button if this kind of content speaks to your soul, and share your thoughts in the comments, because your voice here truly matters. At first, nothing looks different on the outside, and that is what makes this shift so powerful. The empath still shows up, still listens carefully, still notices every emotional change in the room, still cares in the same deep way that has always defined them, but internally something has quietly transformed, like a door closing so softly that no one hears it click shut. Before this moment, the empath absorbed everything: the narcissist's moods, their anger, their insecurity, their silent treatments, their emotional storms. All of it passed straight into the empath's nervous system, as if it were their responsibility to carry. They tried to fix, to soothe, to understand, to be patient, to be the emotional anchor for two people instead of one, believing that if they just loved harder, explained better, or stayed calmer, things would eventually improve. But then comes the silent shift, the moment when the empath begins to observe rather than absorb, when they still hear the words but no longer let those words pierce straight into their core, when they still see the behavior but no longer feel the urge to excuse it or repair it. This is not coldness, and it is not cruelty, it is awareness waking up. The empath starts noticing patterns instead of getting lost in emotions. They begin recognizing manipulation instead of internalizing blame. And for the first time, they understand that not every feeling in the room belongs to them. That realization alone is life-changing. The narcissist's power has always depended on emotional access, on knowing they can provoke guilt, confusion, fear, or hope with just the right words or behaviors. But when the empath stops reacting the same way, when the emotional hooks no longer land, the entire dynamic begins to weaken. The narcissist might sense something has changed before they can even name it. The empath's energy feels different, their responses are calmer, their explanations are shorter, their emotional availability feels more selective. And this subtle shift often creates discomfort for the narcissist, because they can no longer predict or control the empath's inner world. What's important to understand is that this transformation does not happen overnight, and it usually comes after a long period of exhaustion, confusion, and emotional pain. The empath does not wake up one day suddenly detached. They arrive here slowly, through countless moments of feeling misunderstood, through repeated cycles of giving too much and receiving too little, through the quiet realization that no matter how much they pour into the relationship, the dynamic never truly balances. Eventually, something inside them begins to prioritize self-protection over self-sacrifice, not out of bitterness but out of survival. They start questioning their automatic responses. They pause before apologizing for things that were never theirs to carry. They notice the difference between compassion and self-betrayal. And in those small pauses, in those moments of awareness, their power begins to return. The empath still cares, but now their care includes themselves. They still feel deeply, but they are no longer drowning in feelings that were planted there by someone else. This is why this stage is so destabilizing for the narcissist, because manipulation requires emotional reactivity to function. When the empath no longer over-explains, no longer chases closure, no longer tries to manage the narcissist's emotions, the usual tactics lose their effect. Gaslighting doesn't work as well on someone who trusts their perception. Guilt loses its grip on someone who understands their own boundaries. Silent treatment loses power over someone who has learned to find peace within their own space. The empath begins to witness the narcissist's behavior almost like an observer, noticing the patterns, the deflections, the emotional games, without immediately jumping in to fix or soften the situation. And that witnessing alone changes everything. It is in this quiet, internal shift that the empath reclaims their identity, because they stop defining themselves through how well they can manage someone else's emotions and start recognizing their own emotional experience as valid and worthy of protection. They are no longer trying to earn love by self-abandonment. They are no longer measuring their value by how much they can tolerate. They are simply becoming conscious, present, and grounded in themselves, and this inner stability is something the narcissist cannot easily penetrate. The most powerful part of this transformation is that it does not need to be announced, proven, or justified. It speaks for itself through energy, through boundaries, through the calm refusal to engage in old patterns. The empath does not become harsh, they become clear. They do not become distant, they become discerning. And once this shift has occurred, the relationship dynamic can never return to what it was, because the empath has crossed an invisible threshold from unconscious emotional absorption to conscious emotional awareness. And with that awareness comes a strength that is quiet, steady, and nearly impossible to control. The narcissist's greatest fear is not abandonment, not criticism, and not even failure, but the terrifying possibility of being truly seen without the mask they worked so hard to perfect. To the outside world, they often appear confident, charming, impressive, and emotionally in control, and this image is not accidental. It is carefully constructed through stories, behaviors, and subtle manipulations designed to shape how others perceive them. Every compliment they give, every vulnerability they reveal, every act of generosity they perform often carries an unspoken purpose: to protect the image, to maintain control, and to keep the deeper insecurities hidden from view. For a long time, the empath is usually drawn to this surface charm, believing they have found someone complex, misunderstood, or deeply wounded who simply needs patience and understanding. They try to see the best, to look beyond the flaws, to interpret harmful behavior as pain rather than pattern. But when the empath awakens, something changes in the way they look at the narcissist. They no longer listen only to the words. They start paying attention to the contradictions. They notice the gap between promises and actions. They observe how kindness is often conditional, how apologies feel empty, how accountability is always redirected. And instead of confronting with explosive emotion, the awakened empath confronts with something far more unsettling: clarity. This clarity is calm, grounded, and difficult to manipulate because it is not fueled by anger or the need to prove anything. It is fueled by awareness. The empath no longer argues to be understood, no longer debates reality, no longer tries to convince the narcissist to see their perspective, because they finally understand that the confusion they experienced was not accidental, it was part of the design. They begin to see the performance for what it is, the charm as a tool, the victim stories as strategies, the emotional swings as methods of control. This is where Carl Jung's idea of the shadow becomes deeply relevant, because the shadow represents the parts of ourselves we refuse to face, the traits we hide, deny, or project onto others. The narcissist spends their life avoiding their shadow, burying shame, insecurity, envy, and fear beneath layers of superiority and control. And when someone sees through that illusion, when someone reflects back the truth without emotional distortion, it feels like psychological exposure. The empath does not need to accuse or attack. Their perception alone becomes a mirror, And that mirror is unbearable for someone who has built their identity on illusion. The narcissist may respond in predictable ways. When this happens, they might become defensive, dismissive, sarcastic, or suddenly cold. They might attempt to regain control through gaslighting, blame shifting, or emotional withdrawal. They might intensify their charm in an attempt to pull the empath back into the old dynamic. But beneath all these behaviors lies the same core fear, the fear of being exposed. Being truly seen means the narcissist can no longer rely on their carefully crafted story. It means their tactics lose their effectiveness. It means they can no longer manipulate the empath's compassion so easily. And what makes this even more destabilizing is that the empath does not need to announce what they see. They don't need to say, "I've figured you out." Their energy shifts, their questions become sharper, their responses become shorter, their emotional reactions become more measured. The narcissist begins to feel that something is slipping, that the emotional strings they once pulled so easily are no longer connected in the same way. The empath's clarity disrupts the illusion because it introduces something the narcissist cannot control: truth. Not dramatic truth, not shouted truth, but quiet, steady, grounded truth that lives in the empath's perception and boundaries. This is why being truly seen feels so threatening to the narcissist's ego, because the ego survives on validation, admiration, and control. And when someone looks at them without being impressed, without being confused, without being emotionally hooked, the false self begins to crack. Jung believed that growth requires facing the shadow, integrating the hidden parts of the self rather than denying them. But the narcissist resists this inner work because it feels too painful, too destabilizing, too threatening to the identity they've built. The empath, on the other hand, has already begun that inner work, and through their awareness, they become a living mirror of psychological truth. And that mirror, more than any argument, more than any confrontation, more than any emotional outburst, is what truly unsettles the narcissist, because it silently exposes what they have spent their entire life trying not to face. The return of the shadow is not a dramatic moment filled with anger or confrontation. It is a deeply internal experience that unfolds quietly but changes everything. For most of their life, the empath has been conditioned to be the understanding one, the patient one, the forgiving one, the one who absorbs discomfort to keep peace in the room. And over time, this identity of being the good one becomes both a source of pride and a hidden prison. They learn to associate love with self-sacrifice, safety with silence, and worth with how much they can tolerate. And because of this, they often reject parts of themselves that feel uncomfortable, such as anger, frustration, resentment, or the desire to say no. They push these emotions down, telling themselves they must always be kind, always compassionate, always available, even when their own needs are being ignored. But eventually, this inner suppression reaches a breaking point, not in the form of explosion, but in the form of awareness. This is where Carl Jung's idea of the shadow becomes so important, because the shadow represents the parts of ourselves we hide, deny, or judge, and for the empath, the shadow often contains their rightful anger, their unmet needs, their boundaries, and their truth. When the empath finally begins to meet their own shadow, it can feel confusing at first, because they may worry that they are becoming selfish, cold, or unkind, when in reality they are simply becoming honest with themselves. They begin to notice the moments when they feel hurt, but normally would stay silent. They start recognizing the resentment that builds when they overgive. They become aware of the inner voice that says, "This doesn't feel okay." And instead of dismissing it, they start listening to it. This shift is not about becoming harsh or losing compassion. It is about integrating the full range of their emotional experience. The empath begins to understand that their anger is not something to fear, but something to understand, because anger often carries important information about boundaries that have been crossed and needs that have been neglected. They realize that constantly trying to be good at the cost of being honest only leads to emotional exhaustion and loss of self. As this integration happens, the empath's sense of identity begins to change. They no longer see themselves as someone who must earn love by being endlessly accommodating. They begin to see themselves as someone who is allowed to have limits, preferences, discomfort, and truth. This inner shift creates psychological wholeness because instead of splitting themselves into acceptable and unacceptable parts, they start to embrace themselves as a complete human being. Jung believed that real growth comes from this process of individuation, where we bring the unconscious into consciousness and become more whole rather than more perfect. And for the empath, this means accepting that they can be both kind and firm, both compassionate and direct, both understanding and unwilling to tolerate harm. This wholeness is exactly what makes them immune to emotional exploitation, because manipulation only works when someone can be made to doubt their own feelings or ignore their own boundaries. When the empath trusts their internal signals, when they respect their own discomfort, when they allow themselves to say no without guilt, the emotional hooks that once worked so effectively begin to lose their power. They no longer need to explain their boundaries excessively. They no longer feel responsible for managing other people's emotions. They no longer feel pulled to rescue, fix, or soothe at their own expense. Instead, they become grounded in themselves, responding rather than reacting, choosing rather than complying. What makes this transformation so powerful is that it does not turn the empath into someone hard or bitter, it turns them into someone authentic. Their kindness becomes a choice rather than a reflex. Their generosity becomes intentional rather than compulsive. Their silence becomes thoughtful rather than fearful. And because they are no longer fragmented internally, they become much harder to manipulate externally. The narcissist, who once relied on the empath's guilt, self-doubt, and over-empathy, finds fewer and fewer emotional entry points. Because the empath is no longer fighting against their own shadow, they are standing beside it, learning from it, and using its wisdom to protect themselves. This integration creates a quiet strength that does not need to announce itself, a confidence that does not depend on approval, and a clarity that does not require constant validation. The empath does not become someone else through this process, they become more fully themselves, and in that fullness they finally experience the freedom of no longer being controlled by the need to be endlessly good, endlessly patient, or endlessly self-sacrificing. Emotional detachment is one of the most misunderstood stages in the empath transformation, because from the outside it can look like indifference, coldness, or distance. But in reality it is something far more intentional and far more powerful. For a long time, the narcissist has survived on emotional reactions the same way a fire survives on oxygen. Every expression of confusion, every moment of guilt, every emotional outburst, every attempt to explain, every tear, every question, every plea for understanding becomes a form of supply that keeps the dynamic alive. The narcissist learns which buttons to press, which words to use, which silences to deploy, because each reaction confirms that they still have access to the empath's inner world. But when the empath begins to detach emotionally, something extraordinary happens. They still hear the words, they still see the behavior, but they no longer feel the same internal urgency to respond, to fix, to justify, or to chase resolution. The emotional charge that once fueled the connection slowly fades, and in its place appears a quiet, steady calm. This is not the cold silence of punishment, it is the peaceful silence of someone who has finally stepped out of the emotional storm. The empath no longer feels pulled into arguments that go nowhere. They no longer feel the need to defend their reality against distortion. They no longer feel responsible for soothing emotions that were never theirs to manage. Instead, they begin responding with neutrality, brevity, and clarity, and this shift changes the entire structure of the relationship. The narcissist's usual tactics begin to fail because those tactics were designed to provoke strong emotional reactions. Gaslighting depends on self-doubt. Guilt tripping depends on over-responsibility. Silent treatment depends on fear of abandonment. But when the empath detaches, these strategies no longer land with the same force. The empath does not argue with distorted narratives, they simply disengage. They do not beg for connection, they accept space. They do not chase emotional clarity, they trust their own perception. This quiet withdrawal becomes deeply destabilizing for the narcissist because the game they have been playing requires participation. Without emotional reactions, there is no rhythm to the manipulation, no predictable cycle to exploit, no energy to feed on. The empath's detachment removes the emotional mirror the narcissist once controlled, and suddenly the narcissist is faced with something they are not prepared for. Emotional emptiness where attention once lived. The empath is no longer reflecting admiration, no longer reflecting distress, no longer reflecting confusion, and without that reflection, the narcissist's sense of power begins to weaken. What makes this stage so profound is that the empath does not need to announce their detachment. There is no dramatic declaration, no explosive confrontation, no need to prove anything. The shift is communicated through consistency, through calm, through the refusal to engage in emotional chaos. The empath's energy changes. Their tone becomes steadier, their responses become simpler, their presence becomes less reactive, and this subtle change often creates increasing discomfort in the narcissist, who may try harder to provoke, escalate, charm, or intimidate in an attempt to restore the old dynamic. But the more the empath maintains their emotional distance, the more the narcissist begins to unravel internally. They may grow more irritable, more insecure, more unpredictable, because the emotional control they once relied on is slipping away. The empath's detachment does not destroy the narcissist, it simply removes the emotional fuel that kept the dynamic alive. And without that fuel, the patterns begin to collapse under their own weight. The empath, meanwhile, begins to experience a new sense of inner stability. They feel less anxious, less emotionally exhausted, less mentally consumed by the relationship. They begin to reclaim mental space that was once occupied by overthinking, overanalyzing, and emotional labor. They start to realize how much of their energy had been invested in managing another person's emotional world, and how freeing it feels to redirect that energy inward. Emotional detachment allows the empath to observe the relationship more clearly, to see behaviors without the fog of emotional overwhelm, and to recognize truths they may have ignored for a long time. They no longer view every conflict as a crisis that must be solved. They no longer see every emotional shift as something they must respond to. Instead, they develop a grounded perspective that protects their peace. This is why emotional detachment is often more powerful than confrontation. Confrontation can be twisted, denied, argued against, or used as fuel for more manipulation. Detachment, on the other hand, offers nothing to argue with. It offers no emotional charge to feed on. It offers no intensity to exploit. It is simply a quiet withdrawal of energy, attention, and emotional investment. And in that silence, the narcissistic game begins to collapse because the empath has stopped playing. The mirror that once reflected everything the narcissist needed now reflects nothing, and in that emptiness, the narcissist is left to face their own instability, while the empath finally experiences the calm of emotional freedom. Power is not reclaimed in a loud, dramatic moment. It returns quietly, steadily, and with a sense of certainty that feels unfamiliar at first but deeply grounding. For a long time, the empath lived as an emotional prisoner without fully realizing it, constantly measuring their words, their reactions, their needs, and their boundaries based on how someone else might respond. They learn to scan for emotional shifts, to anticipate moods, to soften their truth, to over-explain their intentions, and to shrink their needs, all in the hope of preserving connection and avoiding conflict. Validation became something they unconsciously sought outside of themselves because their emotional safety depended on being understood, accepted, and approved of by the person who held emotional power in the relationship. But when the empath begins to reclaim their inner authority, the entire dynamic starts to change. They no longer look outward for permission to feel, to think, or to exist as they are. Instead, they begin to trust their own internal compass, their own perception, and their own emotional experience. This is where the shift from emotional prisoner to psychological authority truly takes place. The empath stops explaining themselves to people who are committed to misunderstanding them. They stop justifying boundaries that exist for their own well-being. They stop trying to convince others that their needs are valid because they no longer doubt that truth within themselves. This is not a move toward coldness or emotional distance. It is a movement toward sovereignty, toward self-ownership, toward a sense of inner leadership. Their words become fewer but more intentional. Their decisions become clearer and less reactive. Their energy becomes grounded rather than anxious. They begin to understand that boundaries are not walls built out of anger, but expressions of self-respect. This is where Carl Jung's concept of individuation becomes deeply relevant, because individuation is the process of becoming who you truly are rather than who your wounds, your fears, or your conditioning shaped you to be. For the empath, trauma often taught them that love must be earned through self-sacrifice, that conflict must be avoided at all costs, that their worth lies in how much they give, and that their needs are secondary to the needs of others. Individuation is the slow unraveling of those false beliefs. It is the moment when the empath begins to separate their authentic self from the survival strategies they once adopted to stay emotionally safe. They start recognizing that people-pleasing was not kindness, but fear. They begin seeing that over-explaining was not clarity, but anxiety. They realize that shrinking themselves was not humility, but self-abandonment. And with this awareness, their identity begins to solidify in a new way. They no longer feel pulled to prove themselves. They no longer feel anxious when someone misunderstands them. They no longer feel responsible for managing how others feel about their choices. This inner stability is what reverses the power dynamic. The narcissist, who once relied on the empath's self-doubt, emotional overinvestment, and need for approval, begins to lose influence when those traits disappear. The empath becomes unpredictable in the best possible way, not because they are playing games, but because they are no longer operating from the same emotional patterns. They are no longer trying to maintain harmony at any cost. They are no longer negotiating their worth. They are no longer seeking permission to exist fully. Instead, they move with quiet confidence, making choices that align with their values rather than their fears. Their presence begins to feel different to those around them. There is a calm strength in the way they speak. There is a clarity in the way they make decisions. There is a firmness in the way they hold their boundaries without anger, without apology, and without excessive explanation. This is psychological authority, the kind of authority that does not dominate others but governs the self. It is the difference between being controlled by emotional triggers and being guided by inner wisdom. It is the difference between reacting to every emotional wave and choosing how to respond with intention. And as this authority grows, the empath begins to experience a sense of freedom that once felt impossible. They are no longer trapped in emotional cycles they did not choose. They are no longer constantly questioning themselves. They are no longer living according to someone else's expectations. They are living from their own center. This is not arrogance, and it is not detachment from humanity. It is self-alignment. The empath does not become less caring through this process. They become more honest. Their compassion becomes grounded rather than compulsive. Their generosity becomes chosen rather than automatic. Their presence becomes authentic rather than adaptive. And in that authenticity lies real power, because they are no longer performing a version of themselves for survival. They are embodying who they truly are. That is the essence of reclaimed power, not the power to control others, but the power to govern one's own life with clarity, dignity, and inner stability. The final transformation is not dramatic, loud, or fueled by triumph. It is quiet, steady, and deeply irreversible. By the time the empath reaches this stage, they are no longer trying to win, to prove a point, or to change anyone. They have already done the hardest work, which was turning inward, questioning their patterns, healing their wounds, and reclaiming their sense of self. This is where the true divide becomes clear. The empath evolves, while the narcissist remains trapped in ego. The empath's growth happens on the inside, through self-reflection, emotional honesty, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. The narcissist's identity, on the other hand, is built around control, image, and illusion, and because of this, real growth feels threatening rather than freeing to them. For the empath, growth becomes a natural continuation of self-awareness. They learn from pain instead of denying it. They take responsibility for their healing instead of blaming others for their suffering. They begin to see their experiences not as evidence of weakness, but as lessons that shape their wisdom. This inner work changes the way they move through the world. They become more grounded in their values. They become more selective with their energy. They become more honest in their communication. They become more aligned with who they truly are rather than who they once needed to be to survive emotionally. The narcissist, however, often remains locked in defensive patterns because their ego depends on avoiding shame at all costs. Instead of reflecting, they deflect. Instead of healing, they perform. Instead of growing, they reinforce the same cycles of manipulation, projection, and control. This creates an unbridgeable gap between the two, not because the empath becomes superior, but because they become self-aware. The empath's journey leads them toward authenticity, while the narcissist's patterns keep them trapped in performance. Over time, the empath begins to realize that they no longer feel emotionally pulled toward the narcissist. The attachment that once felt overwhelming begins to dissolve, not through force, but through clarity. They see the relationship for what it was. They understand the dynamics that kept them stuck. They forgive themselves for staying too long, and most importantly, they stop trying to save someone who refuses to face themselves. This is where the concept of outgrowing someone becomes very real. Outgrowing does not mean rejecting with anger, it means moving beyond. The empath no longer resonates with the emotional frequency of manipulation, confusion, or control. They begin to value peace over intensity, clarity over chaos, authenticity over approval. The narcissist often cannot follow this evolution because it would require them to dismantle the very identity they have spent their life protecting. True growth would require accountability, vulnerability, and self-examination, and these are precisely the experiences the narcissist avoids. As a result, while the empath moves forward into greater self-understanding, the narcissist often repeats the same cycles with new people, telling the same stories, using the same tactics, seeking the same validation. The empath's transformation is rooted in healing, while the narcissist's survival is rooted in repetition. When the empath finally walks away whole, grounded and self-aware, something profound happens. There is no desire for revenge. There is no need to prove anything. There is simply a sense of completion. The relationship no longer defines them. The pain no longer controls them. The emotional hooks no longer exist. They carry the lessons, not the wounds. And this is why the empath does not destroy the narcissist in the end. They simply outgrow them. They stop participating in the dynamic altogether. They stop offering emotional energy to something that no longer aligns with who they have become. That withdrawal of energy, attention, and emotional investment is the ultimate return of power, because it is not about control over another person, but about ownership of the self. The empath reclaims their life, their identity, their peace, and their future. They choose relationships that feel safe rather than intense, connections that feel mutual rather than draining, and environments that support growth rather than demand self-abandonment. And in that choice lies the deepest form of freedom. The narcissist may continue to operate within the same patterns, seeking new mirrors, new sources of admiration, new emotional supply, but the empath is no longer available to play that role. The journey has come full circle, not with bitterness, but with wisdom. Not with conflict, but with clarity. Not with collapse, but with quiet strength. This is the final transformation. The empath no longer reacts, no longer resists, no longer engages in the old dance. They simply move forward as a whole person, fully aware, fully grounded, and fully free.